The scar on her forearm was the last thing Admiral Marcus Hale expected to see in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, and it stopped his heart colder than any battlefield ever had, because that scar belonged to a woman he had buried 10 years ago. He had stood over her grave himself. He had thrown the first handful of dirt. He had told his grandson, years later, that his daughter Elena had died in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway outside Norfolk, her body identified by dental records because the crash had left so little behind. He had grieved her in the quiet, disciplined way career military men grieve, by never speaking her name too loudly, by keeping her photograph in his wallet instead of on his desk, by pouring himself into 30 more years of service so the silence at home wouldn't swallow him whole. And now, in this dim ICU hallway, watching a nurse peel off a blue latex glove to reveal a jagged scar tracing the exact same line the surgeons had once described to him after Elena's supposed emergency surgery years before the crash, he felt the floor tilt beneath his polished shoes. If this story of impossible reunions and buried truths is already pulling at something in your chest, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe to Midnight Tales, because the family you think you've lost is not always as lost as the world tells you. The nurse's name tag read E. Marsh, and when the Admiral said Elena's name aloud, not Marsh, but the name he had whispered over a casket a decade ago, she froze the way a person freezes when a door they had sealed shut is suddenly thrown open from the other side. Her eyes, the same storm-gray eyes her mother once had, lifted to his face, and for 3 full seconds neither of them breathed. The monitors beeped steadily behind them, indifferent to the small earthquake happening in that corridor. She did not faint. She did not run. She simply stood there in her scrubs, 10 years older, 10 years harder, and let him look at her the way a starving man looks at food he no longer believes is real. To understand how a father could bury his daughter and still find her alive, you have to go back to the year everything fell apart. Elena had been 26, newly married to a man named Victor Reyes, a defense contractor with a smile that charmed everyone except, eventually, her. What began as long work trips became unexplained absences. What began as generous gifts became a cage dressed up as love. She told her father nothing, because Victor had made sure of that, isolating her slowly, the way abusers do, cutting threads one at a time until she didn't notice the net closing until she was already caught in it. The Admiral, deployed overseas for long stretches and trained to trust the chain of command more than his own instincts, missed the signs a father should never miss. He believed the polite phone calls. He believed the excuses. He did not know his daughter had started planning her disappearance the way she once planned science fair projects, meticulously, secretly, and out of pure necessity. The accident, it turned out, had been real, but the body inside that car had not been hers. A woman named Carla, a friend from the shelter Elena had quietly reached out to in her final desperate weeks, had died that night in a crash that was never fully investigated, and Elena, bruised, terrified, and out of options, had let the world believe the worst so that Victor would finally stop looking for her. She took the name Marsh from a nurse she'd once idolized in high school. She rebuilt herself from nothing, worked 3 jobs to pay for nursing school, and buried her old identity so deep that even grief counselors would have called it unhealthy, except grief was never the point. Survival was. For 10 years she lived like a woman underwater, always aware that surfacing meant risking everything, her safety, her new life, and the father she loved too much to endanger by reappearing while Victor still had money, lawyers, and a temper that had never cooled. She told herself the silence was a gift she was giving him, sparing him the danger of knowing the truth. She told herself that every single night shift, every single time she saved a stranger's life in that ICU, was a kind of penance and a kind of proof that the life she'd stolen back from the wreckage was worth living. But grief has its own gravity, and it pulled the Admiral toward her without either of them planning it. His grandson, Elena's nephew, a boy named Tyler who had been in a serious car accident himself just days earlier, was the patient lying in that hospital bed, unconscious, machines humming around him like a low mechanical prayer. The Admiral had flown in the moment he got the call, terrified of losing another piece of his family, and it was in that terror, in that same ICU where fate apparently keeps its cruelest and kindest jokes, that he found the daughter he thought the earth had already taken from him. The corridor confrontation was not gentle. It could not be. 10 years of grief does not dissolve into relief in a single instant. It curdles first into disbelief, then into a kind of controlled anger that only a father who spent a decade visiting an empty grave could understand. He asked her, voice shaking in a way his soldiers had never once heard, how she could let him mourn her, how he could have stood at a funeral and wept for a woman who was, this entire time, breathing, walking, saving lives just a few states away. Elena did not defend herself with excuses. She simply rolled up her other sleeve, revealing an old bruise-shaped scar near her collarbone, and told him, quietly, that she had not been running from him. She had been running to save the only thing she had left of her family, the chance that one day she might come home to him alive instead of in a box. What followed in the days after was not a fairy tale. It was harder than that, and more honest. There were long, raw conversations in hospital waiting rooms, tears that came without warning, silences that ached with everything unsaid for a decade. The Admiral, a man trained to command fleets, had to learn to simply listen, to let his daughter's story unfold at her pace instead of demanding it all at once. Slowly, the anger gave way to something gentler, pride, disbelief, and a fierce, protective love that had never actually died, only waited. He learned that Victor had been quietly investigated and was now serving time for financial crimes unrelated to Elena, which meant, for the first time in 10 years, she did not have to look over her shoulder. The threat that had kept her hidden was finally gone, and she hadn't even known it. And Tyler, the boy in that hospital bed, woke up 3 days later to find not only his grandfather at his bedside, but an aunt he had never known existed, gently adjusting his foreline with hands that had learned, over a decade of hiding, exactly how to keep people alive. If this story moved you even a little, if you believe that love finds its way back no matter how many years or how much distance stands in between, please take a moment to comment the word family before you go, so we know this story reached you and touched something real inside your heart. In the months that followed, Elena Marsh did not stop being a nurse, she simply stopped being alone while she did it. The Admiral visited her apartment every Sunday, learning the small details of the life she'd built without him, her favorite coffee order, the plants on her windowsill, the framed photo of Carla she kept to honor the friend whose sacrifice had bought her a second chance. He never once made her feel guilty for surviving. Instead, he told her, the way only a father who has learned the terrible cost of assumptions can tell his child, that being alive to be found was the greatest gift she had ever given him, greater even than the years he thought he'd lost. If you believe, like the Admiral finally learned to believe, that it is never too late to come home to the people who love you, then let this story stay with you a little longer, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe to Midnight Tales for more stories that prove the human heart can survive almost anything, as long as somewhere, someone is still waiting for you to come back.